$327 million. Gone in just 48 minutes. Not by bombs, not by war, but by the silent stroke of a keyboard in a government building thousands of miles away. A nation, Burkina Faso, left gasping for breath, salaries frozen, medicines blocked, hope disappearing with every failed transaction. But just when the world thought it would buckle, one man walked into the depths of the earth, not to surrender, but to fight back. Covered in dust, beneath the harsh lights of a gold mine, Traoré didn't beg. He didn't blame. He reminded his people of something they had forgotten. They froze our virtual wealth, he said. Let's remind them of our real wealth. What happened next didn't just defy expectations, it redefined the rules. A moment of silence became a blueprint for resistance. This is a story of injustice and genius, of how a former colony faced modern-day economic warfare and answered with courage, strategy, and the power beneath its soil. And though this story blends fact and fiction, the emotions are deeply real. The questions it raises about power, control, and justice belong to all of us. So we invite you to watch not just with curiosity, but with reflection. Because sometimes a fictional story tells a deeper truth than a headline ever could. Paris, 9:17 a.m. Morning rain beads on the gray stone facade of the French Ministry of Finance, turning every window pane into a sheet of trembling mercury. Inside, fluorescent lights hum over endless rows of polished desks, an army of keyboards, screens, and silent civil servants in crisp navy suits. At the back of the operations hub, a single monitor blinks red. A junior analyst, no older than 25, leans forward, heartbeat suddenly loud in his own ears. On the screen, a terse, three-line communiqué stamped urgent/reservé. He hesitates, swallows, then passes the file up the chain. Within 60 seconds, it reaches the Director of International Monetary Controls. Freeze all assets of the Burkina Faso Central Reserve. Immediate execution. No exemptions. No explanation. No debate. Just a digital guillotine poised above an entire nation. The director's finger pauses above the enter key. Around him, the hum of servers, the shuffling of papers, the faint echo of footsteps in marble hallways. All normal office sounds suddenly feel predatory. He inhales once, smelling toner ink and cold coffee, then presses the key. The silent detonation. Invisible packets of code race through fiber optic cables, skitter across the channel, leap oceans. They arrive in Frankfurt, London, Washington. Nodes in a financial nervous system older than most modern states. Databases update. Transaction queues halt. Autopay scripts die mid-instruction. Across 6 time zones, a red banner flashes on banking dashboards. Account blocked. Funds frozen by Order 118-B. Nobody outside the bubble of high-level finance sees the blast. Yet the shockwave ripples outward, silent as carbon monoxide. Cut to Ouagadougou, T-15 minutes. The sun is already punishing the tin roofs of Burkina Faso's capital. Vendors set out baskets of mangoes. Children weave through traffic, their laughter mixing with the smoke of two-stroke engines. At the Ministry of Economy, a systems engineer finishes her morning coffee and logs in to run payroll. The screen returns an error she has never seen. Foreign reserve lock, contact central authority. She frowns, tries again. Same error. On the other side of town, a hospital procurement officer clicks confirm purchase on a shipment of anti-malarial drugs. Payment rejected. He refreshes, confused. Rejected again. The delivery truck, already en route, will soon turn around. T-5 minutes. Dominoes start to fall. ATM queues lengthen. Cards are declined at gas stations. A trucking company's entire fleet idles because the digital fuel vouchers fail to load. And still, nobody knows why. There is no televised coup, no plume of smoke, no headline. Only the invisible hand tightening its grip. Inside the presidential palace. A narrow corridor, humming air conditioners, the smell of waxed wood. Advisors rush toward the situation room, phones pressed to ears, voices clipped. Treasury gateways are timing out. IMF buffer inaccessible, zero liquidity by Friday. If salaries stall, the barracks will panic. They burst through heavy double doors where Ibrahim Traoré sits alone at a long mahogany table, eyes fixed on a tablet. Transaction logs scroll like falling rain, each line a heartbeat stopped. He does not look up. One aide whispers, "Monsieur le Président, Paris just strangled us." The word hangs, strangled, ugly, suffocating. Traoré's thumb flicks the screen. Refused, blocked, failed. A slow exhale. Somewhere outside, a muezzin begins the call to prayer, the voice drifting above the city like a plea no one will answer. Seeds of suspense. Why now? Why an amount so precise? $327 million, not a cent more? What leverage does Paris think it holds that bullets could not deliver? Most important, what will this quiet, steel-eyed president do when the oxygen of money is cut off? The aides expect rage or at least frantic orders. Summon the ambassador, draft an appeal, call Washington, beg. Instead, Traoré issues one calm directive. Gather the full council in 45 minutes and find me the latest production figures from every gold mine in the country. Gold? In the midst of a liquidity crisis? The room jolts. Confusion crackles in the air. But his tone leaves no room for questions. Cliffhanger. Outside the palace gates, life continues. Markets bustle, taxis honk, children chase plastic footballs. Yet a silent countdown has begun. 45 minutes to decide whether a nation bends or breaks. And somewhere deep beneath the Sahel, in shafts lit by battery lanterns, thousands of tons of untapped ore wait in geological patience. Real wealth immune to foreign passwords. The question lingers, pricking every mind that hears it. When numbers can vanish at the press of a key, what is a nation truly worth? And who truly owns it? Burkina Faso's collapse did not arrive with the sound of sirens or soldiers. It came quietly, like a glitch, a pause, a moment that didn't feel like a moment at all. At precisely 9:35 a.m., inside the Ministry of Public Service, a payroll technician clicked the green disperse button. Nothing happened. She frowned, clicked again, still nothing. The screen blinked, then froze entirely. She rebooted her workstation, thinking it was just an internal server delay. Meanwhile, 287,000 public sector salaries sat in digital limbo. Across the city, in a cramped, sweltering pharmacy warehouse, a manager pressed her fingerprint to authorize the clearance of a vital consignment. Insulin, antibiotics, prenatal vitamins. The system returned a red prompt. Payment verification failed. Code 1026. She tried 3 more times before she called the Ministry of Health, who had no answers. The drugs would not be delivered. The trucks wouldn't be loaded. Somewhere, a child's fever would rise unchecked. At the same time, in a municipal fuel depot outside Bobo Dioulasso, fuel card authorizations suddenly stopped working. Tankers were ready, drivers stood by, but the payment system refused to process a single drop of fuel. Within the hour, 40% of the country's transportation fleet was grounded. Back in Ouagadougou, at a dusty government building near the National Archives, a low-level finance officer received an automated report she didn't understand. It showed over 300 block transactions, government payments, supplier credits, international contract settlements, all marked halted external freeze. She didn't panic at first. She printed the file, highlighted the strangest codes, and walked it upstairs. 2 floors up, her superior read the report in silence, then picked up the phone. His voice shook as he spoke. "We have a systems-level freeze. This isn't just technical." By midday, the inner circles of government had begun to understand what had happened, but they had no idea what to do. No one had anticipated an economic weapon of this precision. No bombs, no troops, no sanctions to protest at the UN. Just disconnection, as if the country had been unplugged from the global economy without a sound. In the presidential palace, the Situation Room buzzed with restrained chaos. Reports arrived by the minute. School grants not received. Medical imports locked. Mining equipment delayed at border checkpoints. Even food contracts, rice, wheat, milk powder, were stuck in frozen intermediary payments. Nothing moved. Not money, not goods, not time. And outside, the city breathed on, oblivious. Children laughed in schoolyards. Motorbikes weaved through traffic. Street vendors roasted corn and sold scratch cards. No one knew that, behind the scenes, their entire economic structure had been paralyzed, not by local failure, but by a command whispered from a foreign capital. The silence inside the palace grew heavier with every second. Advisors whispered in corners, stared at graphs with disbelief, refreshed screens that still showed the same brutal message. Assets blocked. Order 118B. There was no music in that room, no speeches, no shouting, only the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional metallic ping as another transaction failed. One aide turned toward the president, voice low but trembling, as if afraid the words themselves would break something fragile. If we can't access payroll by Wednesday, there will be demonstrations. If subsidies freeze, transport collapses, then food, then fuel, it'll move fast. Someone else muttered, and if the military goes unpaid. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Traoré remained still. His tablet screen now showed a new chart, one with sharp downward lines in every sector: energy, health, defense, infrastructure. His index finger traced one of them, slowly, as if memorizing the fall. No one in that room dared ask the question they were all thinking. Was this the end? And yet, even amidst the unraveling, there was no panic in his eyes, just something colder, more calculating. Not surrender, not yet. No orders were given, no statements released to the press. The country's news anchors read from pre-written scripts, unaware of what had happened behind closed doors. The people carried on, blind to the knife edge they now lived on. Their lives were normal for now, but the heartbeat of the state had already been cut off. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't even a fall. It was a slow freeze creeping through every vein of the government, locking arteries one by one. And still, no one outside knew. Not yet. But something was coming. The air in the Situation Room had gone stale, thick, like the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. 12 senior officials sat rigid around the polished table, their suits rumpled, their expressions tense. The wall clock ticked loud, too loud, as seconds dragged into minutes. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't said a word in nearly 45 of them. He sat still, unmoving, eyes locked on the tablet before him. The screen hadn't changed. Transaction failures, system errors, locked reserves, blocked access. The red warnings pulsed like an open wound, and yet he remained motionless, as if studying not the data, but something beneath it. A pattern, a weakness, a truth. Around him the council grew restless. The Minister of Finance cleared his throat, his voice unsure but urgent. Mr. President, we need to act. This is not sustainable. Without international clearance, our reserves will remain frozen. We should, at the very least, open a channel with Paris. Start negotiations. Someone else added more cautiously, perhaps a temporary concession. A guarantee to protect French investments. They're sending a message, not declaring war. If we respond reasonably, another interrupted. They might lift the freeze. Quietly. No one loses face. Heads nodded reluctantly. The word face hung in the air, sharp as glass. But Traoré said nothing. He didn't raise his eyes, didn't blink. His silence had become oppressive. Not passive, purposeful. It filled the room, pressing down on the others like weight, like warning. It made them doubt their instincts, their training, their fear. Then at minute 48, he finally spoke. Not with a command, not with anger, just a single question, calm, precise, deadly. Who owns our gold mines? The room froze harder than the money. For a moment, no one understood. They exchanged glances, waiting for clarification, for a follow-up. There was none. The question sat there, heavy and immovable. Not rhetorical, not symbolic. Real. The Minister of Industry shifted in his seat. Technically, most of the licenses are held by multinational firms, Canadian, French, South African. But oversight falls to the Ministry of... Traoré held up a hand. He didn't want legal definitions. He wanted the truth. Who controls the earth beneath their feet? Who profits when gold is pulled from Sahel soil? Who decides what stays and what leaves? Who signs the contracts? Who enforces them? Who benefits? The silence that followed was not one of confusion. It was realization. Each man in that room knew the answer, and none of them wanted to say it aloud, because the answer wasn't us. Outside, the hum of city life continued. Cars crawled through traffic. Radios played pop songs. People lined up for bread and SIM cards. And yet the most important decision in Burkina Faso's modern history was being born in a room with no shouting, no blood, no speeches. Just silence, and one question that changed everything. It was just past 6 a.m. when the national broadcast abruptly cut away from its usual news cycle. No prior announcement, no press release, just a sudden black screen. And then the feed resumed. But it wasn't a studio. The picture that returned was grainy, industrial. The camera shook slightly, adjusting to low light. Viewers across Burkina Faso leaned in, confused. The scene was underground, clearly a mine shaft. Walls of coarse rock stretched into the dark. Harsh overhead lamps cast a sickly yellow light. The air looked thick, like it hadn't been stirred in years. And there, standing in the center of the frame, was a figure few recognized at first. It wasn't the Traoré they knew. Gone was the crisp military uniform. Gone were the polished boots, the lapel pins, the presidential posture. In his place stood a man in dust-covered overalls, steel-toe boots, and a scratched helmet with a weak headlamp that barely lit the space around him. His hands were calloused, his face streaked with sweat and gold dust. The silence of the shaft was complete. Even the workers around him, real miners, not security, stood still, eyes down, breathing softly through cloth masks. No one moved. No one spoke. It took the nation a few moments to understand what they were seeing. This was their president, inside a gold mine. The symbolism struck hard and fast. He was underground. He was dressed like them. He was standing, not behind a podium, but on the same soil that had enriched others for decades. His presence in that space, without ceremony, without guards, without grandeur, was louder than any speech he could have given. The camera zoomed in slowly. He lifted his helmet slightly, wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and then looked directly into the lens. And when he spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with clarity. They took what was ours, on paper. He paused, letting the words echo off the shaft walls. But what they can't touch is here. He gestured behind him, toward the black rock veins glittering faintly with embedded gold. The symbolism was unmistakable. The real wealth, the kind no one could freeze, was beneath their feet. Effective immediately, he said, all foreign mining licenses are suspended. Every ounce of gold, every gram of manganese, every drop of oil will be audited, measured, and accounted for. Not by foreign inspectors, by us, for us. The reaction online was instant. Viewers on social media clipped the live stream, sharing it with disbelief and admiration. Hashtags began trending within minutes. Hashtag real gold, hashtag Burkina rising, hashtag Traoré speaks from below. But the most powerful impact wasn't digital, it was emotional. For the first time in living memory, the people saw their leader not above them, not beyond them, but with them, beneath the same ground, breathing the same dust. Back in the shaft, Traoré took a few steps forward, passing equipment that had long carried foreign logos. Machinery bought with foreign loans, operated under foreign contracts, extracting resources that seldom benefited those who dug them. He walked past the drills, the loaders, the steel bins packed with raw earth, and he continued. For too long, we've traded our gold for paper. Paper, they told us, was wealth. Paper they can erase. This, he bent slightly, picked up a small rock glimmering with gold flecks, and held it toward the camera. This they cannot freeze. His voice remained steady, low, deliberate. Let them keep their frozen accounts. Let them hold our numbers hostage. We will not beg for what is already ours. Starting today, we measure value differently. Not by screens, by soil. The camera held on his face, tired, firm, unshaken. Behind him, the miners finally began to move. Quiet nods, a few placing hands over their hearts, others simply standing taller. They understood the weight of what was happening. This was no performance. This was declaration, disruption, defiance. Not just against Paris, but against decades of quiet exploitation. In that moment, the mine wasn't just a place of labor. It became a podium, a battlefield, a throne. And across the country, indeed across the continent, millions watched as a man cloaked in dust did something no clean-suited official had ever dared. He rewrote the meaning of wealth from beneath the earth. The camera lingered. The silence in the mine pressed in like stone. Then Traoré stepped forward, not just into the frame, but into history. There was no teleprompter, no podium, no flag fluttering behind him. Just the raw industrial glow of overhead lamps, the scent of oil and dust, and a president in a worker's uniform, breathing the same heavy air as the miners around him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness was his amplifier. "They froze our virtual wealth," he began, his words slow, deliberate, and sharp. "So let's remind them of our real wealth." The sentence echoed through the mine and into living rooms, smartphones, radios, and televisions across the country. In a single line, he exposed the illusion, the lie of financial dependency, the fragility of numbers on screens. People paused mid-task. Shopkeepers turned up their radios. Families gathered closer to their televisions. Traoré continued, lifting a handful of dirt and letting it fall between his fingers like grains of time. "For too long, we've allowed others to measure our worth by their systems, by their banks, their reserves, their approval. But real value doesn't vanish with a keystroke. Real value is buried beneath our feet, waiting for us to reclaim it." He looked to his left, where an elderly miner stood watching. A man whose hands had carried this country's hidden wealth for decades without ever seeing where it went. Traoré nodded to him, not as a gesture of power, but of respect. Then he turned back to the camera. "Effective immediately," he said. "All foreign mining licenses are suspended." The words struck like a hammer. Across boardrooms in Paris, Toronto, Johannesburg, alarms began to sound. Executives sat upright. Emails flew, but the speech was only just beginning. "Every ounce of gold will be audited. Every gram of manganese measured. Every barrel of oil accounted for. No more blind contracts. No more hidden agreements. No more paper promises in exchange for stolen wealth." He paced as he spoke, not out of nerves, but out of fire, like the words themselves were dragging him forward. "From this day forward, every extraction will be recorded. Every truck, every shipment's destination will be known, not just by ministers, but by citizens. Every gram will now be counted, every drop owned." Somewhere in the capital, a boy no older than 10 stared wide-eyed at the screen, whispering the words under his breath. Owned, counted, understood. Traoré stopped walking. He stood still again, centered beneath the harsh mine light. His shadow fell unevenly across the dirt floor, cutting between machines that had run day and night for decades without ever paying tribute to the land that gave them purpose. "We are not enemies of progress. We are the authors of a new kind of progress," he said. "One built not on charity, but sovereignty. Not on dependency, but dignity. We will sell our resources, but on our terms. We will partner, but with equals." In that moment, the weight of centuries shifted. The old playbook, where African nations begged for access to what was theirs, where decisions were made behind closed doors in foreign languages, where ownership was a fiction dressed in legalese, was being torn up line by line. Traoré raised one hand, palm open, as if holding something invisible. "Let the world know, Burkina Faso is no longer for sale. Our wealth is not a gift. It is not a burden. It is not collateral. It is the inheritance of our children, and we will treat it as such." The feed held for a moment longer. The light flickered behind him. Somewhere far above, the world turned on its axis. In homes across West Africa, eyes filled with tears. In some rage, in others, hope. But all of them felt it. Something had changed. What they had just witnessed was not merely a speech. It was a line in the sand, A declaration written not on paper, but in dust, sweat, and the truth of the earth itself. And across the continent, as word spread, one phrase traveled faster than any satellite broadcast. He spoke from underground, but his words shook the sky. The video didn't need promotion. It didn't need editing. It didn't even need subtitles. It needed only to exist. Within minutes of its broadcast, the mind speech began spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just replayed, it was felt. Phones buzzed across the country. Screens lit up in internet cafes, on cracked tablets in classrooms, on shared television sets in village markets. The words echoed through Bluetooth speakers, WhatsApp groups, neighborhood loudspeakers. By the hour's end, even those who hadn't seen the video could recite parts of it by heart. They froze our virtual wealth. Let's remind them of our real wealth. Every gram will be counted, every drop owned. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag real gold, hashtag Burkina rising, hashtag from the soil, hashtag Traoré underground. Young people remixed the speech into rap tracks. Artists painted murals of Traoré in miner's gear, fist raised, haloed by golden light. In university dorms, in open-air cafes, in dusty border towns, the reaction was the same. Pride, disbelief, a surge of clarity. For once, they weren't watching a leader perform. They were watching a man belong to his country. By midday, the streets of Ouagadougou began to shift. It started with students, small groups waving homemade signs repeating Traoré's words. Then came teachers, market women, civil servants who hadn't yet received their salaries, but marched anyway. They weren't demanding change. They were defending it. The crowds grew. Chants erupted. Some wept. Others danced. But all of them moved with a common rhythm, a shared defiance that pulsed louder than the silence of the freeze. "We are not poor," one woman shouted into a news microphone. "They only made us forget what we own." Across the mining regions, something even more unexpected happened. At gold sites operated by foreign contractors, workers began to walk off the job, quietly without violence. They laid down their tools, gathered at the gates, and refused to continue until independent audits were launched. Some carried handwritten signs. "No more hidden gold. This land talks now. Audit or leave." Executives were blindsided. No one had predicted that Traoré's words would reach this deep, this fast. Some tried to downplay the speech, labeling it populist theater. But the truth was undeniable. He had touched a nerve older than any contract, deeper than any investment. In cities across West Africa, civil society groups began holding meetings, screenings, and solidarity marches. The speech was translated into local languages, played on radios, shared over loudspeakers at mosques and churches. For the first time in years, the people weren't reacting to crisis. They were responding to courage. Not everyone agreed. Some in the elite called it dangerous, reckless, a gamble. But even they admitted quietly that something irreversible had begun. Because in just 24 hours, the question had shifted from "can we survive this freeze?" to "what else have we forgotten is ours?" And that question, once lit, could not be unfired. In Paris, confusion was rapidly turning to concern. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been attempting to re-establish contact with Burkina Faso's government for nearly 24 hours. Their diplomatic channels were open, their ambassadors were calling, their envoys were ready. But Ouagadougou wasn't answering. There was no press release from the presidency, no scheduled meeting, no official statement. Just silence. Inside the French embassy compound in Burkina Faso's capital, staff moved restlessly, pacing polished corridors with tablets in hand and brows furrowed. The ambassador himself had drafted a carefully worded communiqué offering dialogue and de-escalation, hinting at a partial lifting of the asset freeze if Traoré would agree to reinstate certain foreign contracts. It was a document designed to offer a face-saving retreat for both sides, if only someone would acknowledge it. But no one did, not even a rejection. Traoré had disappeared. Security officials confirmed he hadn't entered any government buildings that morning. His motorcade hadn't moved. The palace gates remained shut. Local journalists speculated he was in the countryside, consulting tribal leaders. Others guessed he was bunkered in a military facility, plotting retaliation. But no one, not his cabinet, Not his foreign ministry, not even his own press secretary could say where he was. That's because he hadn't told them. At precisely 5:12 a.m., before the sun rose, Traoré boarded a small, unmarked aircraft at a military airstrip on the outskirts of the capital. There was no formal announcement, no escort, just a lean team of aides, a pilot from the National Air Force, and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The flight plan listed only a generic regional consultation as its purpose. By the time Paris noticed the silence, the president of Burkina Faso was already descending over Bamako. The runway was empty except for 3 waiting vehicles. No red carpet, no media, no protocol. Traoré stepped off the plane into a thick Sahelian heat, his boots crunching the gravel as he walked briskly toward the convoy. The streets of Bamako were still waking, markets opening, tea boiling, radios murmuring news from Ouagadougou. No one in the city knew that 3 of West Africa's most consequential leaders were about to meet within walking distance. At a secure compound tucked behind a modest government building, no palaces, no fanfare, Traoré sat across from Assimi Goïta of Mali and Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger. 3 men, 3 flags, 1 purpose. No cameras, no translators, no lawyers, just leaders. What began as a quiet conversation over strong coffee quickly shifted into something far deeper. They didn't freeze Burkina Faso's money, Goïta said. They froze all of our futures. This is no longer about one country, Tiani added. This is about breaking the pattern. Traoré said nothing at first. Then he leaned forward, voice steady. We are stronger together. If they divide us, they can drain us. One by one. The others nodded. No speeches were needed. They had all lived under the same pressure, the same threats, the same quiet humiliations dressed as diplomacy. Now, for the first time, they were in a room not to receive instructions, but to write their own. Over the next several hours, a rough draft was born. Shared gold reserves, unified trade protections, a regional emergency fund, independent of European control, and a commitment to transparency that would extend not just across governments, but to the people themselves. The concept was radical, but rooted in necessity. Each of their nations held pieces of a larger puzzle: gold, uranium, oil, geographic leverage. Alone, they could be coerced. Together, they could bargain. They named it SECO, Sahel Economic Coalition, a union not of ideology, but of survival. As night fell over Bamako, the final handshake carried no media flash, no diplomatic choreography, just 3 hands gripping one another across a wooden table stained with coffee rings and marked up maps. Across the continent, no one knew what had just happened. But in the embassies of Europe, something had shifted. The silence from Ouagadougou was no longer a mystery. It was a message. And the real negotiations, now, were no longer about money. They were about control. By sunrise the next day, the doors of the conference room in Bamako opened, not to a crowd of journalists or a sea of microphones, but to silence and sunrise. Inside, 3 presidents stood around a long wooden table scattered with empty teacups, inked notepads, and maps of the Sahel crisscrossed with red lines. What had begun as a strategic conversation was now something far more consequential: the birth of a revolution in economic self-determination. The SECO Pact had been signed. There were no ceremonial pens or gilded documents, no applause, just the creak of old chairs and the steady scratching of 3 signatures, each one etching a line across decades of dependence. The Sahel Economic Coalition would not be another hollow alliance of ambition without structure. It was designed with purpose, practicality, and teeth. At its core were 3 pillars: shared gold reserves, a regional barter-based economy, and a completely independent financial infrastructure verified through blockchain. First, the gold. Each nation, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, would contribute to a joint emergency reserve held across multiple physical locations in all 3 countries. These vaults would contain real, audited gold bullion, not promises or digital placeholders. France and other Western creditors could freeze international transfers, but they could not touch what was stored beneath African soil. This gold would act as collateral not for loans from outside powers, but to secure internal trade, crisis relief, and regional development. Second, the currency, or rather the lack of one. Instead of continuing to rely on the euro or US dollar, the very currencies weaponized against them, the pact implemented a radical barter system. Trade between ASECO nations would be conducted directly in goods, services, and verified resource values. Oil for grain, gold for medical equipment, uranium for infrastructure development. Transactions were assessed based on weight, utility, and time, not manipulated exchange rates set by foreign central banks. It was a step backward only to those who misunderstood history. Barter wasn't regression, it was liberation. Third, the network. To ensure accountability and transparency, every transaction under the SECO framework would be recorded on a public blockchain ledger. This was not just for governments or central authorities, it was for the people. Every citizen of the coalition would be able to view, verify, and audit the flow of resources. Anyone with a basic mobile phone could see how much gold was stored, which mine it came from, how it was used, and whether the proceeds went into public projects. If they fear us using numbers, let's beat them with truth, Traoré had said, eyes unwavering as he pushed the idea forward. This wasn't just transparency, it was economic democracy. Each nation agreed to build local blockchain infrastructure with open source code and redundant physical servers. No single country would own the system. No foreign auditor could manipulate it. The ledger would be updated in real time, not quarterly, and the data freely available to any citizen with a connection. Goida had called it the people's receipt. Tiani had called it the weapon they cannot freeze. Within hours of signing, the leaders issued a joint broadcast, short, direct, and unapologetically defiant. They stood side by side, not behind a podium, but in front of a map of the Sahel, arms crossed. "We are not against the world," Traoré said, "but we will no longer be beneath it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet confidence of sovereignty did all the talking. That afternoon, while the global media scrambled to confirm rumors of the pact, internal teams began implementing SECO's protocols. Engineers linked national databases to the shared blockchain architecture. Economists calculated baseline commodity exchange ratios. Miners in Niger were handed printouts showing exactly how the gold they extracted would now fuel schools and hospitals. Across the continent, something was shifting. In Ghana, a finance minister asked quietly for technical specifications of SECO's reserve-sharing model. In Chad, a student-led forum began discussing the possibility of a regional ledger for their oil fields. In Senegal, headlines asked a single question: can this be our model too? Meanwhile, in Paris, Brussels, and Washington, analysts pored over the SECO documents with growing unease. They had frozen Burkina Faso's money, expecting desperation. Instead, they had catalyzed the creation of the most independent economic bloc in modern African history. And it wasn't asking for permission. The corridors of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, usually filled with calm confidence and quiet diplomacy, were now buzzing with a rare and unfamiliar emotion: panic. At exactly 10:12 a.m., Paris time, a coded diplomatic request was sent from the Élysée Palace to the French embassy in Ouagadougou. Request an immediate meeting with President Traoré. The tone was urgent, but not alarmist. France, after all, still fancied itself in control. By 2:47 p.m., the response arrived. A single-line message: President Traoré is not available. No meeting can be scheduled at this time. There was no explanation, no future time proposed, no window left open for negotiation. It wasn't just a brush-off, it was a statement. France had been officially shut out by a country it once ruled, advised, banked, and believed it could still command. Worse, Traoré wasn't even in the country. By then, the news of the SECO Pact had broken beyond African borders. The Financial Times ran a front-page piece with the headline, "Sahel Nations Unchained from the West, a New Financial Frontier." On French business news channels, anchors attempted to maintain composure as the real impact became clear. In less than 24 hours, the stock value of several French mining conglomerates operating in West Africa, especially those with stakes in gold and uranium, plummeted by over 12%. Investors scrambled to interpret what the SECO barter system and joint gold reserves meant for existing contracts. The answer was clear to anyone reading between the lines. The old rules no longer applied. In Brussels, an emergency economic intelligence briefing warned that resource nationalization, once a fringe threat, may become a region-wide reality. In Paris, the Office of the Minister of Finance received a memo from Société Générale's crisis desk titled bluntly, "The Sahel has left the building." And yet what disturbed policymakers most wasn't the sudden fall in equities or even the diplomatic snub. It was the silence from the Sahel. Traoré wasn't tweeting. Goita wasn't issuing press releases. Tiani wasn't holding summits. The three presidents weren't gloating or seeking validation. They were simply acting. While Europe talked, they built. And that terrified those who had always counted on African leaders needing a seat at someone else's table. At Le Monde, an editor hesitated before publishing a provocative headline, "Have we lost Africa?" His hand hovered above the keyboard, knowing it sounded dramatic. But it was also undeniably the question now on every diplomat's mind. France had played its hand: economic pressure, diplomatic coldness, and financial disruption. But the result was the opposite of what they expected. Instead of isolating one nation, they had unified three. Instead of causing collapse, they had ignited innovation. The backlash wasn't just diplomatic, it was continental, and it was only just beginning. The sun had not yet fully risen over Ouagadougou when the national broadcaster cut to a quiet room inside the presidential palace. There was no podium, no French flag, no ceremonial setup. Just President Ibrahim Traoré, seated at a small wooden table, dressed not in a suit but in a modest cotton tunic. His eyes looked directly into the camera, not above it, not around it, but through it. And this time he wasn't speaking in French. He opened in Moré, the native tongue spoken by millions across Burkina Faso. It wasn't just a symbolic decision. It was strategic, intimate, revolutionary. "My brothers, my sisters, they froze our money. But they could not freeze our courage. They could not freeze our land. They could not freeze our truth." His voice was steady, almost gentle, but beneath it pulsed something undeniable: momentum. Around the country, elders leaned closer to radios. Youth turned up the volume on their phones. Market vendors paused mid-sale. Civil servants, miners, soldiers, everyone listened. This wasn't just a leader addressing a nation. This was a man telling a family what came next. "You have heard many big words these past weeks," Traoré continued. "Barter system, blockchain, decentralization. But today I want to explain it with something you already understand: the ground beneath your feet." He held up a small gold nugget in his hand. No symbolism, no metaphor, just a glint of real, unpolished metal. "This is from a mine near Gawa. Maybe someone in your family has worked there. Maybe you passed it on the way to school. Maybe you've never seen it at all. But this is yours, not mine, not a foreign company's. Yours." He paused, letting that idea land. "For too long, we allowed others to take our gold and tell us we were poor. Now we will watch the gold. Every gram. From the moment it leaves the earth to the moment it becomes a roof over your head, a road in your village, a hospital for your children." The camera slowly zoomed in. He was no longer holding the nugget. He was holding a phone. "Today I announce the birth of the People's Ledger." A logo appeared on the screen, simple, bold, a golden dot inside a digital circle, surrounded by three words in Moré: Sika, Nere, Biga, Gold, Trust, Future. This ledger is not run by politicians, not by banks, not by foreign inspectors. It is run by math, by proof, by the truth we can all see. If 1 kilo of gold is extracted, you will see it. If it is sold, you will know the price. If revenue is collected, you will see what it funds. No more whispers, no more missing billions, no more lies. He tapped the phone. "You will also receive a dividend. Yes, you. Every citizen will have a personal account on the ledger. Every 3 months, you will receive your share from the nation's resources. Not a gift, not welfare. Your right, your gold, your dividend. Somewhere in the north, in a village without electricity, But with solar-powered phones, a mother stared at her son as he translated the speech aloud from a neighbor's loudspeaker. In the capital, young university students began cheering mid-sentence. In the goldfields, tired workers looked up from their shovels. In the halls of foreign embassies, diplomats sat stunned, watching the translation scroll across their screens. Traoré wasn't just announcing a platform, he was announcing a new contract between government and governed. A new social currency built on visibility, not promises. A future not dictated by banks in Paris, but by miners in Bobo Dioulasso, mothers in Kaya, teachers in Banfora. He ended the broadcast not with applause or slogans, but with a final, quiet declaration. They built systems to control us with paper. Now we build systems to free ourselves, with truth. The screen faded to black, but the echo of his voice remained in living rooms and loudspeakers and hearts across the continent. And in that silence, something unspoken became clear. This wasn't just about gold. It was about ownership. It was about dignity. It was about coming home to what was always ours. The next morning, Burkina Faso woke up to something more revolutionary than a policy change. It was a new way of seeing. Across the country, a single app began to spread like wildfire. It was lightweight, less than 50 megabytes, designed to work on even the oldest Android phones. The icon was unmistakable, a gold circle nested inside a glowing outline of Burkina Faso. Below it, 3 words pulsed in the local dialect: your gold, your voice. The app didn't require Wi-Fi. It didn't need constant updates. It was built to operate in the harshest rural conditions, using SMS fallback for feature phones and caching for offline sync. And it had one purpose: to return power to the people. As soon as a user opened the app, they were prompted to scan a QR code. Each region, each district, and each mining site had its own. These codes had already been posted at town halls, schools, local radio stations, and health clinics. Once scanned, the app instantly pulled live data from that mine: the exact number of grams extracted that day, the company responsible, the market value, and the projected dividend. You didn't need to be an economist to understand it. The interface used color-coded bars, intuitive icons, and voice narration in multiple local languages. A blinking green light meant gold was moving. A red alert meant irregularities had been flagged. Anyone, whether they were a farmer in the Sahel or a taxi driver in Ouagadougou, could now see the truth in real time. Each citizen was also assigned a unique digital ID, tied not to their name, but to their community registration and biometric fingerprint, ensuring that no one could create fake accounts or siphon dividends. Security experts had helped design the system, embedding it with blockchain technology that verified every step of the resource extraction journey. From the mine shaft to the ministry, every gram had to be accounted for. Every transaction was visible. Every lie had a timestamp. And then came the real surprise: dividends. 3 months after the launch, a quiet ping began to ripple through phones across the country. For the first time, citizens were receiving direct deposits from the nation's resource wealth, not filtered through agencies or ministries, not delayed by bureaucracy. Just a message and a number. You have received 3,500 CFA from the Kamana mine, verified 27 grams. Use it as you wish. It is yours. The amounts were modest at first, but it was never just about the number. It was about the principle. That gold mine from under a mother's home was no longer disappearing into foreign vaults. That the manganese scraped from the hills her husband worked on now helped feed their child. That the oil buried beneath the hot sands of the north now lit the classrooms in her village. No middlemen, no politicians deciding who gets what, no waiting in line, no explaining why your child deserved what was already theirs. Every citizen could open their app and track how much gold their region had extracted. They could see how much went to the National Emergency Fund, how much went into local infrastructure, and how much would be distributed in the next dividend round. It was all there, in plain sight, and if anything went missing, they could report it directly through the app. Their message would be logged on the ledger, and if corruption was confirmed, a red warning would flash across every phone in the region. It wasn't just technology, it was democracy by design. The People's Ledger quickly became more than an app. It was discussed in university debates, printed in farmers' newspapers, analyzed by school children in remote classrooms. A new sense of ownership was taking root. Citizens who had once felt invisible were now auditors of their own future. In marketplaces, people asked one another which mine they were tracking. In tea shops, elders debated how much the reserve fund should hold. In mosques and churches, prayers were offered for the success of our gold, our share. Foreign observers watched in disbelief. It wasn't just that a small West African nation had deployed a functional blockchain system before most European capitals. It was that it had done so with cultural fluency, accessibility, and integrity. And most importantly, it was working. Burkina Faso had turned its pain into purpose, its poverty into participation. And with every verified gram of gold, it wasn't just wealth that was being counted. It was trust, measured in the hearts of a people finally able to see what had always been theirs. And for the first time in generations, no one could take that away. 2 weeks after the People's Ledger went live, the numbers spoke for themselves. Over 4.8 million citizens, nearly a quarter of the population, had downloaded or accessed the platform through their local information centers. Thousands more were joining daily, especially in rural regions where connectivity had long been an obstacle. But the system had been built with them in mind, operating on SMS when smartphones were scarce, translating data into simple visuals and voice prompts when literacy was a barrier. What emerged was not chaos, but clarity. For the first time, citizens could track exactly how much gold, manganese, or oil had been extracted from their region. They could see which foreign companies had operating rights, what agreements had been signed, and where the revenues were being directed. They could watch as funds were funneled into local school renovations, new water systems, road repairs, and more importantly, they could verify it all themselves. Transparency wasn't promised anymore. It was practiced. In the gold belt of Gawa, a mining region that had been plagued by underpayment and corruption for years, workers began to receive full wages. No mysterious deductions, no delays, no bribes. A week after the app launched, a group of mine workers posted a video, standing in front of the entrance shaft, holding up their pay slips and phones, chanting in unison, "For the first time, they cannot lie to us." Across the country, citizen satisfaction began to spike. Call-in shows on radio stations lit up with stories from farmers, nurses, teachers, all sharing how the dividends, though small, were symbolic of something far larger. Ownership. It wasn't just money. It was acknowledgement that they mattered. The world took notice. The headline on the cover of Forbes Africa read, "The Blockchain Revolution Africa Didn't See Coming." Inside was a 6-page spread breaking down the People's Ledger system, from its open-source code to the real-time dividend structure, and why its success had upended every assumption about governance in resource-rich developing nations. Phone calls began flooding into Ouagadougou's Ministry of Technology from unexpected places. Ghana requested a delegation to observe the system in action. Rwanda sent engineers to study the back-end integration with satellite imaging. The Democratic Republic of Congo, long burdened by opaque cobalt mining contracts, asked to pilot a localized version of the platform for its eastern provinces. It wasn't just the innovation that impressed. It was that the platform worked because it trusted the people. For too long, transparency had been treated as a Western export, a conditional reform attached to aid. Now it was an African invention, rooted in lived experience, built with local knowledge, and powered by a belief that ordinary people were not just passive recipients of governance. They were its backbone. And as the digital ledger continued counting gold, gram by gram, across continents, something more valuable was being tallied: hope. It began with a headline that ignited like dry tinder in a storm. The Neo-Colonial Playbook, France's secret plan to destabilize the Sahel, published by Al Jazeera. Investigates, the story sent tremors across Africa and Europe within hours. At first glance, it seemed like yet another sensational report. But attached to the article was a 17-page confidential French intelligence memo, authenticated by cybersecurity analysts and marked in bold red ink, Confidentiel, Diffusion Restrainte. The document, dated 6 weeks before France froze Burkina Faso's financial assets, detailed a chilling operation under the codename Operation Perseus. It laid bare a four-stage plan that, if executed, would quietly strangle the economic lifeblood of three Sahelian nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, under the guise of financial diplomacy. Phase 1. Initiate reserve freezes and delay institutional liquidity to trigger national cash flow disruption. Phase 2. Withhold bilateral and multilateral aid. Introduce regulatory bottlenecks on fuel, medicine, and grain imports. Phase 3. Amplify domestic political dissent via strategic funding of opposition-aligned NGOs and media outlets. Phase 4. Restore selective financial access in exchange for renewed mining contracts in cooperation with French-led development frameworks. The goal? As stated coldly in paragraph 12, projected economic destabilization within 6 to 8 weeks should yield increased dependency and policy compliance in key Sahelian regimes. It was, in no uncertain terms, a financial coup, a blueprint to force sovereign nations into submission without firing a single bullet. Across Ouagadougou, the reaction was instantaneous. Screens in crowded internet cafes lit up. Phones buzzed with urgency. Radio hosts abandoned their music segments to read the memo word for word on air. In government buildings, stunned officials huddled in silence as the reality hit them. The freeze hadn't been about policy. It had been an ambush. But what shook people even more was what Traoré hadn't done. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't begged. He hadn't blinked. He had outmaneuvered it. As news spread, so did anger. Protesters flooded the streets again, not with fear this time, but with fury. Placards read, "We are not France's laboratory. You tried to starve us. We fed ourselves." This is not 1960. Outside the French embassy, graffiti in bold red screamed, "Operation Perseus failed." Media outlets scrambled to catch up. The New York Times ran with the headline, "Leaked Memo Reveals France's Covert Strategy to Control Sahel." The Guardian published a piece titled, "Not Aid, Ambush, Africa's Wake-Up Call." Former French diplomats were cornered in talk shows. One ex-ambassador to Mali admitted anonymously, "We underestimated how fast these nations would adapt, and how far Traoré was willing to go. This wasn't a reaction, it was revolution." At the African Union, member states held an emergency session. For the first time in decades, a united statement emerged. "We reject all forms of neocolonial interference. Economic sovereignty is not negotiable." Behind closed doors, even France's allies expressed discomfort. The language of diplomacy grew colder. Paris, caught flat-footed, offered no apology, only deflections. "We do not comment on leaked materials," they said. But silence in this case was louder than denial. Traoré, for his part, remained quiet. No speech, no televised statement. His absence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say, "I told you so." The world had seen it for themselves. For the people of Burkina Faso, the memo changed everything. Doubts turned to conviction. Traoré wasn't just resisting, he was right. And now the pressure that was meant to break him had lit a fire that couldn't be put out. For 48 hours, Brussels said nothing. No press briefing, no spokesperson quotes, not even a carefully worded non-denial. The European Union, often quick to defend its member states or denounce misinformation, remained eerily silent after the leak of the memo labeled Operation Perseus. Behind closed doors, diplomats were scrambling. But publicly, the institutions of Europe were watching the storm from behind glass, hoping it would pass. France, on the other hand, reacted, but not convincingly. Government officials dismissed the memo as inauthentic, calling it a fabrication designed to destabilize diplomatic trust. No formal investigation was announced. No journalist was sued for defamation. No forensic audit was presented. The denials were vague, evasive, and to many across Africa, insulting. The words did not match the gravity of the document, and more importantly, they arrived too late, because the fire was already burning. In Bamako, protesters marched with signs written in both French and Bambara. "No more chains in our currency." In Niamey, thousands of students organized a sit-in at the French Cultural Center, reading aloud from the leaked memo line by line. In Lomé, Accra, Abuja, and even Dakar, cities once considered diplomatically neutral or softly pro-Western, the conversation shifted rapidly. Talk radio exploded with fury. Pan-African thinkers went viral with live streams titled, "They Tried to Starve Us." Underground hip-hop artists dropped mixtapes overnight, sampling Traoré's speeches with sirens and revolution drums. Public trust in French embassies across the region plummeted. Protests were peaceful, but the message was sharp. We've read the manual. You don't control the story anymore. But perhaps the most extraordinary response came from the one man who had every reason to speak. President Traoré said nothing. He issued no speech, no press release, no tweet. His silence confused foreign media. Was he missing? Was he afraid of escalating the situation? Was he plotting retaliation? But in Burkina Faso, his silence was understood. It wasn't fear, it was strategy. He didn't need to say anything, because now the world had seen what he had tried to tell them all along. The memo had spoken louder than any rally, louder than any broadcast. The strategy of manipulation was no longer theoretical. It had a name, a structure, a timeline, and a logo. Traoré's silence became his loudest message yet. At a weekly press conference, when a foreign journalist asked the government spokesperson why the president hadn't responded publicly, the reply was simple: because the truth speaks, and now everyone is listening. The opposition within Burkina Faso, which had once accused Traoré of paranoia or overreach, fell quiet. Even critics in civil society acknowledged, and this was not fiction. The man they once doubted had simply prepared for a storm they didn't know was coming. Around the region, heads of state who once distanced themselves from SICO now began sending quiet signals of interest. Technical envoys, discreet inquiries. A Ghanaian minister was spotted in Ouagadougou with his entire energy team. From the outside, it looked like diplomacy, but on the inside, it was a reckoning. This wasn't just a moment of outrage. It was the collapse of an illusion. The idea that sovereignty was something granted by the powerful, that Africa had to behave in order to be included, that wealth was something to be borrowed or approved. Those myths shattered in less than a week. And as the old systems fumbled for explanations, a new system simply kept working. No dramatic music, no breaking news banners, just truth, moving quietly, confidently, and undeniably forward. While Europe wavered and scrambled, the global South watched with wide eyes and rising applause. In the corridors of Brasilia, in the think tanks of Jakarta, in policy circles across La Paz, Hanoi, and New Delhi, a new kind of conversation was taking shape. It wasn't about aid or reform or foreign alignment. It was about agency. Traoré's defiance had not only broken a colonial-era pattern, it had offered a blueprint. The digital ledger, the resource dividends, the end of dollar and euro dependency. These weren't just policies. They were weapons of economic dignity, forged in the heart of Africa and now being studied around the world. Within days of the leak, BRICS sent a formal invitation. The message was clear. President Traoré, your vision aligns with our mission of multipolar equity. We welcome your presence at the next summit as an observer and contributor. China praised the People's Ledger as an innovative expression of localized trust architecture. Brazil's finance minister called it a grassroots accountability tool we should all learn from. Even India's central bank issued a statement recognizing Burkina Faso's blockchain platform as a milestone in decentralized economic sovereignty. The most surprising ripple came from Latin America, where countries long plagued by extractive foreign interests found deep resonance in the SICO model. In Bolivia, a national commission was formed to assess whether lithium royalties could be distributed directly to citizens via a transparent digital system. In Peru, indigenous leaders requested a visit from SICO engineers to discuss digital tracking for mining activities in the Andes. Across Southeast Asia, similar murmurs emerged. In Indonesia, officials quietly reached out for technical specs on SICO's barter ledger. In Vietnam, a university economics department released a research paper titled, "The Burkina Breakaway: Can Resources Be Localized Without Collapse?" It wasn't just admiration, it was momentum. And in the midst of it all, Traoré remained grounded. He did not jet off to global forums. He didn't appear in magazine covers or rub shoulders with billionaires. He continued his work quietly, touring mines, meeting with engineers, listening to local councils. Still, the world watched, not because he demanded their attention, but because he had earned it. In an age of algorithms and noise, of viral speeches and hollow slogans, what echoed across continents was something rare, a model that actually worked, and a leader who didn't need to sell it. Traoré had not just challenged an empire, he had inspired a movement. The ripple had become a wave. 2 months after the People's Ledger launched in Burkina Faso, it was no longer just a national innovation. It was becoming a continental revolution. The first to move was Ghana. At a packed press conference in Accra, flanked by economists, engineers, and chiefs from gold-rich Ashanti and Western regions, the Ghanaian president held up a tablet and said calmly, "Our gold has always spoken. Now, it will speak in real time." Their version, dubbed Nsuo Ledger, the word Nsuo meaning flow in Akan, went live that same day. Within minutes, thousands of citizens were scanning QR codes on municipal boards and mining office gates to track the weight of gold extracted in their communities. Ghana's mining ministry issued a public statement. "For decades, we allowed gold to disappear behind contracts we couldn't read." That ends today. What stunned observers wasn't just the speed of the rollout, it was the unapologetic tone. Ghana wasn't asking for approval from the IMF, World Bank, or Paris. They were taking a page from Traoré and reclaiming their wealth without negotiation. Less than a week later, Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, made its own announcement. Their focus wasn't gold, it was crude oil. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, long plagued by accusations of corruption and mismanagement, unveiled a pilot system that tracked the journey of oil from well to refinery to export terminal. For the first time, each barrel extracted from the Niger Delta would be assigned a QR-linked identity. Anyone with access to the new Niger Flow app could scan a product ID and know where it came from, when it was pumped, and what revenue it generated. A school teacher in Lagos could check if her local hospital had actually received its promised oil-funded upgrade. A fisherman in Bayelsa could confirm whether a company had violated environmental guidelines near his village. The oil once used to silence voices was now an open record of accountability. But perhaps the boldest transformation came from the Democratic Republic of Congo, home to over 70% of the world's cobalt, a key ingredient in batteries, smartphones, and electric vehicles. The DRC had long been exploited by multinational tech companies who bought raw cobalt with little regard for origin or ethics. That changed when the Congolese government, in partnership with a coalition of engineers and civil society leaders, unveiled Trace Cobalt, a blockchain-enabled supply chain system allowing consumers anywhere in the world to scan a product and trace the cobalt's origin all the way to its mine of extraction. For the first time, a teenager buying a phone in Berlin or a company ordering EV batteries in California could scan a QR code and see whether their cobalt came from child labor or from certified ethical mines. No greenwashing, no marketing filters, just raw, verifiable truth. "This is not just a transparency tool," said a Congolese official during the launch. "It is our dignity in digital form." Within weeks, global media began referring to the shift as the African Transparency Spring. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the language of governance had changed. No longer was transparency a foreign demand. It was a local invention, driven by need, powered by pride. The world had expected these nations to collapse under pressure. Instead, they had redefined the rules. And the movement wasn't slowing down, it was just beginning. What began as a survival tool in the heart of the Sahel was now becoming a blueprint for a new world economy. Among the first to implement a full-scale adaptation was Rwanda, a country already known for digital governance and innovation. But this time, it wasn't about foreign investment or aid-driven reform. It was about owning the narrative from seed to export. Rwanda launched a unified blockchain platform not just for minerals, but for coffee, tourism, and even foreign aid. Every bag of Rwandan coffee exported carried a traceable digital stamp, showing which farm it came from, what price was paid to the farmer, and where the money flowed. Tourists booking safaris could scan QR codes on their itineraries and see how much of their payment went to local communities versus tour operators. NGOs that operated inside Rwanda were now required to log their spending on the open ledger, giving citizens and donors alike a clear view of impact. The platform was called Umucho, meaning light or clarity in Kinyarwanda. "We don't just want to be transparent to the world," said the Rwandan president during the launch. "We want to be transparent to ourselves." The shock came not from the scope of the system, but from the fact that no one in Kigali had waited for permission to build it. They had simply followed Africa's lead. But the echoes of the People's Ledger weren't limited to the continent. In Chicago, a mid-sized American city launched a pilot initiative based directly on the Burkina model. Residents could log into a platform called Civic Check, where they could track in real time how local taxes were being spent. Road repairs, public libraries, sanitation contracts, every transaction updated daily, backed by a blockchain system co-developed with open-source African engineers. In community forums, American citizens, used to vague budgets and dense bureaucratic reports, began demanding the same clarity they saw in villages across Burkina Faso. One city councilwoman famously said during a debate, "If a farmer in Kaya can track his gold revenue on a flip phone, then my constituents deserve to see where their taxes are going, without needing a PhD." And in Silicon Valley, the reaction was more humble than expected. Top executives from major tech companies, some of whom had previously dismissed the African blockchain model as idealistic, were now requesting closed-door workshops with Seco engineers. What they learned wasn't just technical, it was cultural. The design choices in offline access, community trust mapping, regional translation, were born out of necessity, not theory. They weren't building for hype, one product lead at a major cloud platform admitted. They were building to survive. That's why it works. By the end of the year, think tanks in South Korea, policy labs in Mexico, and NGOs in the Philippines were all studying how to digitally decentralize power in ways that made it accountable to the people, not just institutions. The People's Ledger was no longer just a tool. It had become a philosophy, a reminder that transparency wasn't a privilege of the rich world. It was a right, and it had found its most powerful expression in the places the world once called poor. The announcement came not from Ouagadougou, but from Cambridge, Massachusetts. In a sleek auditorium at MIT, under the bright lights of one of the world's most prestigious technology institutions, a banner appeared on screen that made the audience fall silent. The Traoré Institute for Digital Governance, powered by MIT, named not after a Western donor, a tech billionaire, or a Nobel laureate, but after a Burkina soldier-turned-statesman who had redefined digital democracy without a single Silicon Valley grant. The director of the new institute, an MIT professor of political tech ethics, stepped forward and explained the choice. "We are not honoring a theory, we are honoring a working system, one that came not from a think tank, but from necessity. One that has shown the world how to digitize trust at scale, ethically, accessibly, and equitably." That same month, the first cohort of International Digital Governance Fellows was announced. But this time, they weren't coming to Boston. They were going to Ouagadougou. Students from Harvard, the London School of Economics, Sciences Po, and the University of Tokyo applied in record numbers for immersion programs hosted at Seco's National Training Center. The irony was not lost on anyone. For decades, African scholars had been required to travel abroad to prove their worth. Now the world's best minds were boarding flights to West Africa, notebooks in hand, eager to study a system born from crisis, refined through solidarity, and tested in the fire of sovereignty. They didn't come to teach, they came to learn. And as they walked through the training facilities, past engineers drafting open-source code in 3 languages, past miners learning to read real-time data dashboards, past market vendors checking dividends on solar-powered devices, they realized something that no textbook had ever shown them. This was what democracy looked like when it wasn't imported, but invented. The MIT partnership was just a symbol, but it marked a turning point that even the most optimistic reformers hadn't dared imagine. Africa was no longer a case study, it was a classroom, and the world was finally ready to listen. In a sunlit hall in Ouagadougou, 12 flags lined a circular table. Representatives from Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific gathered, not as clients of the global north, but as co-authors of a new era. They signed what would be known as the Ouagadougou Accords, a multilateral agreement to expand the people's ledger across borders. For the first time, nations like El Salvador, Fiji, and Botswana stood shoulder to shoulder, agreeing not on aid packages or debt terms, but on shared principles: open source transparency, resource sovereignty, citizen dividends. Together they declared, "We will no longer be invisible in our own economies." What made the moment historic was not just the signatures. It was that none of these countries were economic superpowers, but for the first time, they were writing their own rules. In a quiet room, nearly identical to the one where it all began, President Traoré stood alone, looking out the window. The city below buzzed with energy, but the moment was still. The question he once asked in silence echoed in his mind again. Who owns our gold mines? He smiled, not because he knew the answer, but because now everyone else did. The ledger wasn't perfect. Mistakes had been made, systems refined, but something irreversible had happened. The question was no longer rhetorical. It was public property. From miners in Burkina Faso to villagers in Ghana, from oil workers in Nigeria to farmers in Peru, they knew. And more importantly, they believed they had the right to ask. For Traoré, that was the real victory. Not in building a system, but in making ownership a conversation that belonged to the people. Power had always worn the same suit: money, armies, deals behind closed doors. But now it had a new shape: truth, technology, trust. Three forces once seen as abstract were now the bedrock of something more dangerous than rebellion: real democracy. Freedom is not something you request, Traoré once said. It's something you build with your own hands. In the end, France didn't just fail to freeze a nation. They accidentally thawed a continent. Across Africa and beyond, citizens no longer waited for freedom to arrive in briefcases or at summits. They had seen what could happen in just 48 minutes of silence, and what could be created in the wake of that silence. The legacy wasn't Traoré himself. It was the millions who now knew how to answer the question: who owns our future? Now the answer echoed back, strong and clear. We do. The saga of Traoré reminds me that sovereignty is no longer measured by the size of an army or the balance of a foreign bank account, but by a nation's capacity to tell the truth about its own resources, and let every citizen see that truth in real time. When Burkina Faso turned a financial chokehold into an engine of transparency, it reframed power as something distributed, not hoarded. Gold, oil, cobalt, even tax dollars in distant Chicago, all became data points on a public ledger, binding leaders to people with lines of code instead of chains of debt. The ripple was bigger than politics. It was a civic awakening that started in a mine shaft and reached MIT classrooms, proving innovation can rise from necessity and travel outward, not downward. If trust can be engineered, perhaps dignity can be too. What hidden resource, material or human, could your own community reveal if everyone agreed to see it clearly together? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.